Well, here we are once again. This is session 21. I like that. That's 7 times 3. That's 2 prophetic numbers. And once again, you'll see in the handout, I chose 7 as a number to use as a guide tonight. Today is February the 7th, 2023. I wondered if you might have less attendance tonight. Maybe some of you would stay home and watch the State of the Union address. Yeah, but you chose to come here instead. Hopefully there'll be more substance here tonight than what is on the television. But for those who watch this online on the YouTube channel, I encourage you to print out the handout, the attachment that I send by email, because this is a lesson that almost requires you to be looking at the handout or to get a better result, to be looking at the handout. And also, I encourage you to watch it later online to print out or at least have access to the whiteboard, because this is a very, very simple equation that summarizes our lesson tonight, and we'll be getting to that as we go along. It may look a little complicated, but it's quite simple as we go through this. But we're going to get back to Matthew 24. That's where we kind of left off about, 4 or 5 sessions ago. We were in Matthew 24. But we got to verse 15 where Jesus told us to stop and go over to Daniel. So we did what I called a detour into Daniel. And because of that, what he's telling us in verse 15 is especially regarding this abomination of desolation event. So he's telling us we're getting to a key event. You know, a lot of what he talked about leading up to verse 15, especially starting in verse 5 through verse 14, a lot of it's kind of general. It kind of describes the events that will take place over the entire age leading up to his return. Some of these things will increase. Bee asked me tonight, she said, how much does the Bible say about earthquakes, especially like what just happened in Turkey, and what are they up to, like 7,000 dead now or something like that? A lot. And the Bible does say a lot about earthquakes. Even in this passage, we're not really going verse by verse, but verse 7 does talk about earthquakes in various places. And the Bible talks about earthquakes a lot in the book of Revelation. And it often speaks about earthquakes in a context of leading up to the return of Christ is described as birth pains, travail of birth pains leading up to a birth. And so you women understand this, but we men don't near as much, that the birth pains increase in speed and intensity leading up to the birth. And so these kinds of things, like earthquakes, seem to be described in the Bible as increasing in frequency and intensity leading up to the return of Christ. In fact, there's a few verses in Revelation that says there's a great earthquake like has never been. So that's going to be a huge earthquake. But we detoured into Daniel when we got to verse 15. We looked at the verses that talk about the abomination of desolation. And then we spent, I think it was 3 sessions on that one handout of the timeline and all the verses, what happens at the beginning, what happens in the middle, what happens at the end. And again, for those watching online, especially those who are Bible teachers, pastors, and so forth, I encourage you to use timelines. I never see this. I go online and I read books and I hear other men give lectures on the end times. But to me, one of the most effective ways to teach the end times is to draw a simple timeline. and just start plugging in verses and events that happen. Where do they happen along that 7-year timeline? It's just a real good visual way of getting the point across. Instead of like everything being a sword drill, turn to 50 different verses in the course of an hour. You try to, throw as much as you can in, and people are leaving with, yeah, he said a lot, but I don't know really what he said. Just a simple timeline really simplifies the whole process. And then another method that simplifies the process, and we're probably going to do this for 2 or 3 sessions, what we're doing tonight. Side-by-side comparisons of key chapters that speak about the end times. Because what I find out a lot, and I'm sure I've been guilty of this. Okay, let's study Matthew 24. So we're going through Matthew 24. We're trying to figure it all out. And we're not looking at it in context of what Jesus said to do. He said, if you want to know more about what I'm saying, go to Daniel. Because I'm just repeating what Daniel said, and he gives some things in detail that I'm not going to bring up. And then what we're going to find out tonight, Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 did a Bible study of Matthew 24. And 2 Thessalonians 2 is basically a summary or a rewording in his own words, but using key ideas and phrases and terms that Jesus used in Matthew 24. And these kind of side-by-side comparisons reveal a lot. They simplify things. They let you know there's a template, a general template, an outline, a framework that they're all using. They're all using the same words, the same phrases, the same terms, the same ideas. They're borrowing from each other. They're quoting each other. They're referencing each other. And there's like this general template. Now, what would that main template be? I guess we'd have to say Matthew 24 because it's Jesus. So we might describe Matthew 24 as the hub of the wheel. And then 2 Thessalonians 2, and then the book of Daniel, Revelation, some of these other great chapters about eschatology are the spokes off of that hub. But they're all saying the same thing that the hub says. But probably Matthew 24 would be what we would say would be the hub of the wheel. And what you're seeing me trying to do the last few months, and I apologize almost every time, because I never feel like I accomplish it the way I want to, is that the deeper I go into studying the details of this subject, the simpler it is becoming in my mind. And you read after anyone who is trying to become a specialist in their field. It could be nuclear fission, it could be physics, it could, whatever it might be. They all kind of say this. The further I get into the details of it, the understanding of the core of it becomes clearer. And then I can explain it, because a lot of these things that we're talking about, you may only have 5 minutes or 10 minutes to talk to someone. They ask you a question. Why do you believe Jesus is not coming back to the end of the tribulation instead of the first? Okay, you can quote like 25 verses and take them all over the Bible, try to do it in 5 or 10 minutes, and say, I don't even know what you just said. But if you can do something like this, you take one verse that has 2 main ideas in it concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to Him. So, 2 Thessalonians 2 is very dense with information. There's a lot in that chapter. So it's easy to just try to teach the whole chapter and confuse somebody in 10 minutes. But if you take them to the first verse and say, are we clear that Paul is saying this is the subject that he's now writing about? 2 things. The coming, the parousia of Christ, and the episunago, or the gathering together unto Him. There's just 2 main ideas. And then we're going to get to the rest of it as we go through this lesson. So I think one thing that timelines do, or side by side like we're doing tonight does, it removes a lot of the mystery. Because these are large and complex subjects. So how do you simplify it so that whether they end up agreeing with you or not, at least they understand what you're trying to say? And I've come away from a lot of lectures and sermons and lessons and read books and online and all that on end-time subjects. And you know, these guys are really smart and they know a lot of scriptures and they've worked on it for a lot of years, but a lot of times I get through and I think, I really don't know what they're trying to get at. And so you're watching me go through the process right before your very eyes in these last several months. How do I take all this information, boil it down to its essence, and try to get the point across in a clear way? So anyway, those of you online, I encourage you to print this out, to bring up the whiteboard attachment that I send out. Even if I don't send it out, it's in the video, so you can kind of be looking at it while you're watching the video on YouTube. So let's look at this handout. Comparison of Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2, reinforcing the truth found in both. So I call this the unity of terminology in eschatology. And that's not as confusing as it sounds, maybe, because there is a unity of terminology. They're all using the same terms. The common structure removes some of the mystery. Not all of it, but it does make it more understandable. In a further attempt to simplify complex, complicated subjects connected to the return of Christ, the following exercise is one way to accomplish that attempt. The mistake we make is that we tend to see key eschatology chapters like Matthew 24 or 2 Thessalonians 2 as isolated from one another. Okay, we're reading 2 Thessalonians 2. What does that verse mean? What does that verse mean? What does that verse mean? But once the little light bulb turns on inside your thinking of, it sounds a lot like Matthew 24. Maybe Paul did a Bible study in Matthew 24, and now he's trying to teach the Thessalonian church the same things Jesus was teaching. But I'm writing a whole letter, so I'm going to condense it some. But I'm going to use the same terms and the same ideas as Jesus did. And you say, well, someone watching this might be sharp enough to say, well, he wrote 2 Thessalonians before Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. Yeah, but I think most everyone in the know knew what Jesus said in Matthew 24 before Matthew wrote his book. In fact, probably a lot of people who were there, or a number of people who were there, and then those they told it to, wrote it down. Just because a writing is not in the Bible does not mean it's not true or accurate. I think there probably were a lot of recordings or a lot of writings that tried to write down what Matthew ended up, what we call Matthew 24. And they got the main information and they got it right. Because what Jesus taught them, they were teaching. It may have not been written down in a formal book that we call the book of Matthew, but this information was very familiar to the early disciples. And Paul did spend 3 years in Arabia with Christ teaching him personally. Do you think Jesus said, okay, Paul, this entire week, I want to teach you what I taught the disciples in Matthew 24. He probably didn't call it Matthew 24, but he taught Paul what was taught in Matthew 24. So all that to say, Paul had an accurate and complete knowledge of Matthew 24, as we now call it, when he wrote 2 Thessalonians 2. So you got to think these things through, and it makes sense. Okay, let's go through these 7 quickly. I don't want to run out of time. The first thing that's common to both is this parousia idea, which is translated coming or you see over in the second column, 2 Thessalonians, I call it arriving presence. The emphasis of parousia is not the act of coming, it's the result of it. It's the arrival, it's the presence. And that's how it's translated in other verses. But here in Matthew 24, they ask him the question in verse 3, what will be the sign of your coming? And that's parousia. Then I have a footnote, number 1, down to the bottom. The parousia coming of 2 Thessalonians 2:1, of him to gather us to himself, is the same parousia coming of 2 Thessalonians 2:8 to destroy the Antichrist. So we'll mention that again in just a minute. One thing I want you to note in Matthew 24, those 4 verses where he mentions his coming with the Greek word parousia, is that that's one of their questions, but he doesn't get to that particular subject until verse 27 is the next one, and then verse 37 and 39. But the reason I bring this up, and again, things I bring up occasionally, I think, add to the argument. I wouldn't lead with it or make it my main point. But if Jesus is answering their questions and he's describing the events leading up to his return, and he doesn't mention his return until verse 27 and then later, would that promote or not promote the idea of imminence? In other words, it seems like it would be sensible to say something before verse 27 as he's going down through the events of the age. But my parousia, it could be any time. It could be in there any time. But it's as if he's purposely putting it down toward the end of his discussion to bring up that subject again to answer their question, to promote the idea that it's a long way off. It's not going to be imminent or any time. It's way out there in the future. I think at least that adds to the case. So those are the 4 verses in Matthew 24. Then the next one is verse 27. As the lightning comes from the east, flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. And one of the other big statements about the pre-tribulation coming, parousia of Christ, to catch us up in the air and then take us back to heaven for 7 years, is that it's secret. This doesn't sound secret to me. As lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west. Very visible, very noticeable. Not hidden or secret at all. So also will the parousia of the Son of Man be. And then verse 37, as the days of Noah were, so also will the parousia of the Son of Man be. And then verse 39, the same thing, the coming of the Son of Man. I'm wanting you to keep one finger in Matthew 24, another in 2 Thessalonians 2, because we are going to be going back and forth on these. So chapter 2 and verse 1, concerning the parousia, the coming, the arrival, the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that's number 1, the parousia. Number 2, the gathering together to him. So there's 2 main subjects that he wants to address in this chapter. Now, another thing you notice that's interesting about this chapter is he doesn't mention his coming again as he's going down through what's going to lead up to his coming until verse 8. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth, destroyed with the brightness of his coming. The epiphania of his parousia, as we like to say in Greek, the brightness of his coming. That word brightness is translated elsewhere as appearing, but it's just the word to shine. Epi is upon, to shine upon. When you shine upon something, it appears, doesn't it? The If it's in the dark, you shine a light, now it appears. So it carries the idea of appearing because a light has shined. And so this parousia of 2:1 is the parousia of 2:8. I'm going to come back to this again. That footnote that I make, the parousia of 2:1 is the same parousia as 2:8 to destroy the Antichrist. Is there anything in this chapter that would indicate the parousia to gather us to him is a separate parousia than 2:8 to destroy the Antichrist? It's not there. The same parousia to gather his saints to him is the same parousia that he destroys the Antichrist. Now, you really have to force into it. I don't know how you do it really in this chapter, but these are two different comings, 7 years apart. There's nothing inferring it, there's nothing implying it, there's nothing at all to indicate it. So that's our first point of 7, so we need to move on. The second point is deception. Again, 4 verses, just like parousia. 4 times in Matthew 24, he brings up the idea of deception. And I make a little note there. It is the first subject raised after the opening here in 2 Thessalonians 2. So it's a key warning. In other words, the opening is their question in 24:3. Then in 2 Thessalonians 2, the opening is the first, really the first verse, or the first 2 verses, because then he goes on to say, I don't want you to be shook up by all this. So there's this opening remarks, and in both chapters, as soon as the opening part is done with, the first thing, before he gets on to the details of this, what he's writing about, the first thing that Jesus and Paul brings up, and if you look at 2 Thessalonians 2 and 3, and Matthew 24 and 4, Jesus said, take heed that no one deceives you. Paul says, let no one deceive you by any means. Do you think Paul was kind of like quoting Jesus? Do you think 2 Thessalonians 2, in the first statement of verse 3, is simply a direct quote, maybe 1 or 2 words slightly different than Matthew 24:4. So, and then in 2 Thessalonians 2, I show twice the idea of deception is used. First in verse 3, of course, I just read. And then in verse 10, where it says in verse 9, the coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish. So, deception is a big deal in the mind of Jesus and Paul. And I thought about bringing up examples tonight. There was too many to draw from, and we could have spent the whole class chasing this rabbit. But I think all of us feel like the last 3 years, we're being lied to at every turn. And it's intended to deceive. And then almost every time later, when it comes out they were lying to us, they just kind of shrug their shoulders and say something like, well, we meant it for good. We were just trying to protect you. There is mass deception going on all the time right now. And when this man of deception comes along, it's going to be on steroids. Because you think that the powerful people control the media in technology now. Wait till then. It'll be blanket. It'll be total. So you won't receive any information other than what they want you to receive. There'll always be like underground or, little minor kind of radio channels, or maybe we have to all get CBs or something. There'll always be the truth out there. But it's going to be like 99% deception, and 1% you got to go look for the truth. It's hard to find. And the masses of people aren't going to work that hard to find the truth. They're just going to, well, okay, that's what they tell us. I guess that's what it is. So it's mass deception. Number 3, apostasy. And I'll be getting into this more in a later time, but in Matthew 24, verse 10, notice I put down on the handout, the word many is used 4 times. Many, 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 many. Repetition for sake of emphasis. 24:10, many will be offended. That's more than just upset. That means they will fall away. They'll quit. Will betray one another, will hate one another. So it only uses many one time in that verse, but really many could have been used 3 times because it applies to all 3 parts. There'll be betrayal, there will be hatred. We see it building right now, don't we? Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. But they come across, as Paul said in 2 Corinthians, as angels of light. Just like Satan. The masses will not be able to see them as false prophets. They will see them as good men with good words, and they'll be deceived. And nothing has that ability more than religion. Religion has the power to deceive people because it's not just about the mind, it's about the heart and emotions. So you get the total person involved. Verse 12, because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. So I would say that's describing apostasy. It doesn't use the word apostasy, but it's describing apostasy. Paul takes all of those 3 verses and just calls it by one word. But he's really talking about everything in Matthew 24, 10 through 12. But he's summarizing because he's writing a short letter. He's wanted to capture a lot in a few words. So in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, let no one deceive you by any means, for you see the words that day will not come are in italics. I'm not sure if the translators did us a favor by trying to help us understand what Paul meant. I don't really like italics in the Bible because then it becomes commentary. In other words, the translators are trying to tell us what they think the writer meant. And I don't know that that's what Paul meant. I mean, he may have been talking about the day of Christ or the day of the Lord. Possibly so, probably so. But I think he's really going back to his main subject, the 2 events of verse 1. That's what this whole chapter is about, he says. The 2 events of verse 1. So, reading that way, let no one deceive you by any means. The parousia of Christ and our gathering to him. The 2 events of verse 1 will not take place unless or until the 2 things in verse 3. The falling away, and he uses the word first, which also applies to the man of sin is revealed. Those 2 things happen together. The son of perdition. If you really want to fluster someone who thinks they have a handle in 2 Thessalonians 2, it's pretty simple to just look at the first and third verse and say something like, isn't this saying that the 2 events of verse 3 must happen first before the 2 events of verse 1? Isn't that what he's saying? It seems to be clear. So how can there be a rapture resurrection before the falling away and the man of sin is revealed? Because it's a pretty easy argument to say he's not revealed until the abomination of desolation. In other words, the first 3.5 years, he's kind of like, he covers himself for who he really is. It's the middle that Satan incarnates him, empowers him directly. And that's when he commits the abomination of desolation, declares himself to be his God. That's when he's revealed as the Antichrist for who he is. So that's at the middle of the 7 years. So how can the two events of verse 1 happen before the two events of verse 3 when Paul says the two events of verse 3 happen first? I don't know how to overcome that argument. Well, I don't want to, because there's no argument in my mind. Another thing I want you to notice, I think I put in your notes, notice the two definite articles in verse 3. The falling away, that's the Greek word apostasia, the apostasy. And the man of sin, both are specific. So, people kind of struggle with this apostasy idea. They say, well, there's always been people falling away from the truth. And then you think, well, how could there be like one major apostasy in the future? But he is talking about a particular apostasy and a particular man of sin that both happen at the same time, which I think this chapter bears it out in verse 4, which is the abomination of desolation, described in a little different way. The abomination of desolation triggers the two events of verse 3. A line is drawn with the abomination of desolation. The mark of the beast is set up. A line is drawn. People must decide. And therefore, this is when he's revealed openly, and that's when whatever you want to make about the apostasy and who apostatizes, that's when it happens. We're going to be getting into that greater detail at another time. Number 4, the abomination of desolation. It's interesting how Matthew 20, Jesus describes it. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. So this man, the man of sin, is revealed at the abomination of desolation. So he's a man, a literal man. Make sure I press record. Jesus said he's going to be standing in the holy place. Paul says in 2:4, he is sitting in the temple of God. Standing and sitting. Another place, I think it's Mark's version of Matthew, says it's placed. Placed. So he stands, he sits, he places. So that could be where the image of the beast, of the false prophet, sets up, is actually placed in the holy place. Number 5, both mention the temple, and this is where a lot of people diverge. A lot of good brethren I know who are personal friends have a completely different view of this. When Jesus said in 24:15, standing in the holy place, what holy place was he talking about? Sometimes we try to make things overly complicated in the Bible when we should, what's that old saying? Let the plain thing be the main thing. In other words, what is it that makes the plainest, simplest sense? Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives. They were looking at the temple. They were talking about the temple, the literal temple, that the glory of God had already departed from. So it was no longer a true temple in the sense that it was God's house. God didn't consider that building his house anymore. Jesus had already said, your house is left unto you desolate. It's a desolate house. But he's looking at this building, and they're looking at it. What else would they conclude if Jesus is looking at it and says, there's going to come a time when the abomination of desolation takes place, a man is going to be standing in the holy place. Is he talking about some, like church is the temple holy place now, or bodies are the temple holy place? And I don't know actually how that would, what would that look like? The Antichrist sitting in the church, the Antichrist sitting in my, whatever you want to make the temple or the holy place. No. The obvious thing is that there's going to be some sort of rebuilt temple, literally. And this really causes a lot of problem with a lot of people. No, the church is the temple today. No, God wouldn't. No, God doesn't honor that. Well, Jesus is looking at that building and says, the holy place, that's a literal place in that temple. Paul often, I don't know if I did, under footnote 2, good for me. Paul's mention of temple, and I give 5 times in the book of Acts, and I quote one of them, I was praying in the temple. Paul still called it a temple long after the glory of God had departed from it. Paul went into the temple and prayed, but it was a desolate house. Paul went and purified himself and offered a vow in the temple, and he called it the temple. What else would he call it? But he understood that it's no longer the house of God. So why is it so strange to think that a future, some sort of temple on the Temple Mount, they've wanted it ever since they became a nation again. And as I've said, that treaty, that contract, that covenant, the Antichrist signs with Israel that brings about peace in Daniel 9:27 and 26. You read in Daniel, I could go on and on about this. But Daniel calls that the sanctuary. Jesus called it the holy place. Paul calls it the temple. Why do we feel a need to come along and say, oh no, it's some mysterious, spiritual, symbolic meaning that Paul's talking about? He's not talking about a literal temple. Yeah, he's talking about a literal temple. And Israel's going to be able to start their Torah religion again. That's what the covenant that is signed is all about. Israel gets what they want. They stop killing all those Muslim countries that are trying to destroy them. Brings about peace. And then he breaks that covenant in the middle, and he stops the word sacrifice. When he stops the sacrifice in Daniel 9:27, is the Hebrew word for the normal daily sacrifice that they offered in the tabernacle and temple. I'm trying to simplify these things. I'm not trying to find some spiritual, symbolic temple that Paul is talking about when he says in 2:4 that he shall, who opposes and exalts himself. So that's the abomination right there. He's opposing, he's exalting above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So do you want to make this some sort of symbolic? It's the church, it's my heart, it's what does that look like? How does this literal man sit in your temple? So it just doesn't work to me. But his goal is to capture Jerusalem. He wants Jerusalem to be his capital city. In that city is going to be a rebuilt temple. And I think it's just that simple, but others don't. Number 6, the gather together of Matthew 24:31. So 24:31 says, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together, eschatology, or at least a form of it. Some of you watching online, you're going to get technical and say I'm not using the correct form, but that's the root word, eschatology, and the same in Thessalonians, a gathering together. They will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. It's the same word as in 2 Thessalonians 2:1, concerning our gathering together to him. So let's start bringing this. Yeah, good. So let's just talk about this for a minute. Let me simplify this instead of the arrows and the colors and everything that can kind of be a little bit confusing. You take one verse, it has two parts to it, two key Greek words. We've already established that the parousia of 2:1 is also the parousia of 2:8 to destroy the Antichrist. They're the same. It takes hard work to make them different by 7 years. It takes hard work. I don't think it can be accomplished. And then on this side, the eschatology of 2:1 is the same as Matthew 24:31. He sends his angels to gather together his elect. Clearly 2:8 of parousia is post-tribulation to destroy the Antichrist. Clearly, the eschatology of 24:31 is post-tribulation, immediately after the tribulation, verse 29 says. That's when he sends his angels to gather together the elect. So if the same word used in 2:1 is used in 2:8, it's clearly at the end of the tribulation. The same word in 2:1 of gathered together is the same word in Matthew 24:31, which is also clearly post-tribulation. Then how you make those same two words in 2:1 not post-tribulation, I'll just leave it to you to work out. I can't work it out. And then another thing I do in this is to show that this parousia is the same word used in 1 Thessalonians 4:15, that everybody who believes in a pre-tribulation rapture, that is their candy passage, their main passage. I would not have you ignorant, brethren, concerning those who are asleep. For we believe Jesus died and rose again, shall come again, and we believe that he will come again. That's parousia. What's he going to do? And let's just turn there in 1 Thessalonians 4. What's he going to do when he comes back? We say to you by the word of the Lord, in verse 15, that we who are alive and remain until the parousia of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. So the parousia by the same author to the same church used parousia to say Jesus is going to destroy the Antichrist at his parousia. He's going to gather together his people at the parousia. And Paul says in the first letter, 4:15, he's going to start gathering them again, or gather them in a different letter that Paul wrote. Verse 16, the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, the voice of an archangel, the trumpet of God. The dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together. I put this is my own little thing, I put this in a different color of caught up together, because it's not episunagos. It's not the same Greek word as 2:1 and Matthew 24:31. It's the Greek word harpazo, which is where we get rapture. Harpazo is the Greek word that in Latin sounds like rapture. Rapturo, or a form of rapturo, is the Latin, and that's where we get rapture. So there will be a rapture. Who is the rapture for? The rapture is for those who are still alive. The resurrection is for those who have already died. So the rapture and the resurrection are the same time, but the two different groups. Those who are raptured will receive their glorified bodies. Those who are resurrected will receive their glorified bodies. And they'll be caught up together with the Lord in the air. And that's all that passage says. So you have to then extend it based on your own belief. Shall be caught up together with the Lord in the air, so shall we ever be with the Lord. Where? One view says he makes a U-turn and we all go back to heaven for 7 years. But it doesn't say that in this passage, does it? Another view says he's on his way down and we're meeting him as he's on his way down to the earth and he comes all the way. But it doesn't say that in this passage. But I think that's what happens. It's the second, not the first. But to read into this, that because we meet the Lord in the air, as He's coming down, we're caught up to meet Him, does not have to mean that He's coming to meet us so that we can turn back and go to heaven for 7 years. That is read into the passage, but it's not in the passage. To be honest, in the passage does not also say He continues on to the earth in this passage. So you have to let 1 Thessalonians 4 mean what it means, and don't try to force it to mean anything beyond what it says. But I take this caught up together is the same idea as gathered together. It's clearly the same idea. And I think it is the same event. And then the last, and I have a footnote 3, don't I? 2 Thessalonians 2:8, the Parousia. Okay, this is what I just went over on the board. Yeah, and even that part, the next paragraph after footnote 3. And then down at the bottom, Matthew 24, simple timeline. I just put this in here for your benefit. I've said this, half a dozen times already, but a lot of times it kind of takes it in writing for you to really grasp it. The when of 24:15 of the abomination of desolation is the then of 24:21. Then there shall be great tribulation, leading to immediately after the tribulation of 24:29, resulting in the then, the actual coming of Christ, of 24:30, which is when 24:31, the gathering together of the saints happened. So it's just a way to form an outline in Matthew 24 by these time words, when and then, and immediately after, and then. It's those few little words kind of like form the outline of Matthew 24. Then my last one in number 7, He comes as many times as I proofread what I write. I had 24:39. I had a handwrite just before you all got here. It's actually 24:30. It's hard to proofread your own writing. He comes with power and great glory. Paul just says it in a slightly different way, with the brightness of His coming. So I think I'm going to stop there because I covered all I want to tonight. A few minutes early, give a few minutes for discussion, and you can be on your way. So we'll stop the recording.